Singapore has been the magnet for U.S. firms over the years. In fact, a 2023 report by the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore shows that there are 5,700 American companies operating in the city-state. As of 2021, more than 190,000 work in American MNCs. And a third of the 147 surveyed companies report that Singapore citizens make up more than half their senior-level Singapore-based workforce. ASEAN made $41.2 billion worth of foreign investments in the U.S. Now, meanwhile, U.S. made close to $360 billion worth of FDIs in ASEAN. After which, within ASEAN, Singapore accounted for almost 90% of FDIs in the U.S. And for U.S. investments in ASEAN, close to 86% of it is in Singapore, making the U.S. one of the top source economy for Singapore and vice versa within ASEAN. Now, will a new U.S. president have an impact on Singapore's economy? For answers, we have with us guests in the studio, Swan Tek Khin, Head of Research at UOB, and Ang Yue is President of the Association of Small and Medium Enterprises. Thank you so much for joining us today in the studio. Mr. Swan, let's start with you. Singapore's largest foreign direct investor is the U.S. Is there some anxiety over whether this may change with the next president? Because we have to remember that Trump had plans to blacklist Chinese tech giants like Tencent, Huawei. Could that also something like that affect us? Could he also start to pull out of Singapore and ASEAN, perhaps?
Right. I think with the election result is still pending, so there is we are not sure which candidate will become the president.
Sure.
But under a President Trump scenario, there is always this possibility that things can happen, because of his unpredictable nature. So in this case here, we have. If let's say if there's a Trump in power, he has torn up a trade agreement before and also quit multilateral agencies before. So when it comes to ASEAN and Singapore, I think for the US, I think it's still a critical piece for the US diplomacy, for the military strategy, and also for trade policy as well. So it's an important piece. But under the new president, it could happen, right? Things can happen. But they have to balance all the costs and benefits. In the end, I think for ASEAN, it's still an important part. If US were to withdraw, for example, from Singapore or from ASEAN, there will be a vacuum that will be filled by other influencers. Is that something that the US want? Right? Is that something that they really want this? So they have to weigh these kind of possibilities as well. We can never say, it's always a possibility that something like that could happen, but we do have to, the US has to weigh the costs and benefits of doing such a thing.
Mr. Ang Yue, are SMEs concerned?
Yes, I think that, overall, if you look at this year, the economy has been doing so-so, right? It's been pretty much on the sideways basis. And I think that a lot of SMEs are looking to see if you can see any light at the end of the tunnel and whether the policies that comes out post the president US elections will make any difference. And I think that if you look at the variety of SMEs and how different tariffs, policies and US various initiatives would impact, I think the answer is that it's going to be quite varied. But the fundamental thing, I think, for most businesses is that we would like to have some stability. And having a stable policy, and very likely that you can see that more under presidential candidate Harris versus Trump, that would give better prediction, objective for the businesses. And I think that's what SMEs are hoping to see. On the counterpoint, right, you will get a very interesting, unpredictable new opportunities arising when you have very unpredictable policies. So I think it also depends on how agile businesses are. And some of these SMEs will be able to capitalize on that if they are agile and fast.
All right, and the US also shares strong trade links with Singapore. It marks 20 years since it signed an FTA with Singapore. It's only one in ASEAN. Now, over the years, more deals were done, such as the US and Singapore Partnership for Growth and Innovation in 2021 to boost trade and investment, and that was when Harris was vice president. But Trump wasn't much of a fan of mega trade deals. In 2017, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which included Singapore and Japan. Still, by 2022, the US was Singapore's second largest trading partner and Singapore the US 17th largest. In 2023, bilateral trade totaled over $131 billion, with US exports to Singapore reaching nearly $80 billion. Leading exports from the US include commodities, mechanical and electronic equipment, medical instruments, and pharmaceutical products. Mr. Ang Yue, when it comes to trade policies and tariffs, in a speech last month, Trump said the most beautiful word in the dictionary is tariff. Now, he has taken a bold stance here, promising blanket tariffs of 10% to 20% on all imports, in addition to drastically raising existing tariffs on Chinese goods. Can he go back on things like the FTA in Singapore, and what will that mean for Singapore's exports?
Yeah, I think that, like what Dikin was saying, you cannot, predict what will happen. But I would like to also point out that, during his first term as president, there were some very drastic actions around tariffs that has resulted in many businesses that relied on trade flows, right? They had to reconfigure their trading practices and their supply chain. So I think that to some degree, there's some resilience built into our businesses right now in terms of the trade flows and also supply chain. Now, of course, if there's going to be a really serious policy that happens, I think we will have to do a lot more. But I think it wouldn't be as surprising, and people would not be as taken aback by whatever that's going to come out in the coming months. And furthermore, if you look at even with free trade agreement, there's still the origin of goods that you have to deal with, right? And so even under the free trade agreement, many of Singapore businesses already had to deal with the fact that they had to source from multiple sources and reconfigure their supply chain. So I think while it would be worrying, it wouldn't be as big an issue as it happened the first time around.
In past campaign events, Kamala has referred to Trump's tariff plan as the Trump's sales tax, and tariffs aren't really covered in her election promises, Mrs. Swan. But what do we know so far about her stand on trade and exports? Will it be business as usual, you think?
Under President Harris' scenario, I think the trade policy would likely to be a continuation of what Biden has been doing. But although tariff did not come out much, or there wasn't much coverage on tariff, but not to forget, under President Biden, the US did impose quite severe tariffs on Chinese products. For example, EVs, about 100% of EV and other equipment, and also some trade restrictions as well on trade with China, such as high-tech goods and equipment and the like. So in the Harris scenario, in a President Harris scenario, we still have to be careful as well in terms of this trade, whether there's any potential changes to the trade policy out of the US.
Whether it'll be business as usual or not, Trump has berated the Fed Reserve for supporting Biden's policies, and Trump says he would like to have rates go lower. Mr. Ang Yue, is that even possible? And could a Trump win mean better bank rates for our SMEs here?
I think, if you look at the US structure, the Fed is independent of the presidency. So I think there's some degree of separation of powers. But at the same time, if you look overall, I think the Fed policy has been edging slightly downwards, or at least stabilizing or headed in that direction. And I think if you look from SME perspective, having lower interest rate would definitely be more positive than negative. I think having access to cash, having access to capital, ease of capital, having businesses more willing to invest their money into new equipment, new technology, all this would result in a more vibrant economy. And I think that will be definitely positive for SMEs if that's the case.
My final question would be for you, Mrs. Swan. Is there one big trade or economic policy from the next U.S. president that you are hoping to see, that you are watching closely over the next few months because of its potential impact to Singapore?
I think for the potential impact to Singapore, I will be watching very closely of what either Harris or Trump, what they are going to do with the trade policy, particularly tariff. Even under the President Harris scenario, I think tariff will still be on the table. I don't think it's off the table altogether. So as Singapore, we want to be open and we want to be friends, and we rely on multilateral, even bilateral agreements, to keep going. And that is very important for Singapore businesses as well, to to stay on their toes, right? To diversify the markets and also diversify the sources of supplies and all those.
A lot to anticipate. Gentlemen, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us on the U.S. election outcome. Swan Teck Yin, Head of Research at UOB, and Ang Yue, President of the ASME. Thank you. Now, restaurants in Singapore have pushed out U.S. election-themed menus.